Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. I want to introduce you tonight to John Mykytyshyn, who is really a fascinating gentleman. He has been in politics for just a few years. He's a political consultant. He's a public opinion researcher. He's a conservative activist. He's a campaign trainer. He's a TV and radio commentator. And we've got him on our show tonight to talk about a conference that he had just this past weekend on lessons learned during the municipal elections that were recently held. And this was a conference put on by the Conservative Leadership Forum, which he and John Capobianco founded a couple of years ago. John Mykytyshyn, welcome to the show.
Happy to be with you.
Thank you. So tell me, what were the lessons learned during the last municipal election?
There were lots. The way we structured the day, it started off with Brian Patterson, the past president of the Ontario PC Party and a key operative for decades, giving sort of his, he wasn't involved in a municipal election, but he's friends with everybody. So he had a lot of insight to bring overall, some things that worked and some things that didn't. Notably, there's some interesting conversations. And I was going to say, when we planned this conference, we do lessons learned. We do sort of 4 different things, but we do lessons learned events after elections. And none of us could have anticipated that for the second time in a row, 4 years ago, Premier Ford would have decided that it was a good idea to, without consultation or telling anybody during the campaign period, that he was going to take away the right to vote for 2.5 million Ontarians that Kathleen Wynne had given those voters who had regional chairs that were appointed indirectly through their regional councils. And the new premier decided to scrap that. Literally the last day of the filing, if you might remember famously, Patrick Brown had been running for a regional chair appeal and basically got told, yeah, we're eliminating that right to vote. And 3 hours later filed for mayor of Brampton. This time, again, we've gone through another provincial election campaign, not a word about municipal restructuring. There has been talk for the last year about strong mayor powers and changing the process somewhat. But now, after we have this election, again, without anybody having heard about it publicly, boom, as all the municipal councils with regions got elected a few days ago, they all got told a few days later, oh, by the way, you won't be voting for regional chair at your regional council meetings. That's going to be appointed by the premier. So it's like, wow, taking the right away from millions wasn't good enough and giving it to hundreds. He decided to take it away from all of them and just do it himself. So that's people can decide whether that's a good idea or a bad idea. I just know that nobody knew about it until it happened. And that was part of the backdrop for our conference that kind of brought a lot more excitement and interest to it, because usually you have an election and that settles things for a few years. Like even federally in Ottawa with a minority government, because of the deal between the Liberals and the NDP, no one really seriously expects an election for at least 2 more years. Well, after this announcement by Ford, we're not sure what's coming. He might just get rid of the regional government. He might, go to one tier. We don't know what's next in his bag of tricks, or maybe he'll wait till he wins another election to tell us the next round.
So why do you think he got rid of?
Either way, that was great background for us. Sorry?
Why do you think he got rid of the election of regional chairs this wasn't by the people, this was by the councils, and he didn't actually get rid of it. He just said, I'm going to have the right to appoint. And they ended up electing, I think, the people he suggested he wanted to appoint. But why do you do that? Where there are going to be a bunch of people elected that he didn't want there?
Well, 4 years ago, it was pretty straightforward. We all believe it was done just to stop Patrick Brown from becoming the Peel chairman. This time, because he has other plans, he's got legislation and he wants to make sure that development and housing actually gets built, because depending upon the municipality, it's almost impossible to get anything built. I don't know what it is in Mississauga or in Toronto, but I live in Dundas, which is part of Hamilton, a one-tier government that got amalgamated under Mike Harris, and it takes 7 to 10 years to get anything built here. The other end of the scale in Brampton, as I was watching Patrick Brown get sworn in for his second term of office and listening to him give his speech of accomplishments, the average build in Brampton takes 13 months. So certainly it's not equal across the province. And the premier thought that some municipalities needed a assistance or a good kick in the pants, depending on your perspective.
So it sounds like two-tier government in Brampton's situation actually was beneficial, and one tier in Dundas is not.
Yes. So again, it's the world's kind of upside down, and we'll wait and see. But we had that as the backdrop to the conference, which was great because then people came in to talk about the election, kind of a past thing, but also municipal elections and the importance of them moving forward. So Patterson kicked off the day. Then I did a session on we basically called it the Battle of Brampton, because I was Patrick Brown's campaign manager.
Okay, well, we're going to take a break and come back and talk about the Battle of Brampton, because I think that's really kind of interesting. And I think there's a lot of interesting lessons in that one. So we're going to take a break with John Mykytyshyn. We're talking about lessons learned during the last municipal election by the Conservative Leadership Forum. John Mykytyshyn is one of the co-founders of that organization. Stay with us, everyone, and we're going to come back and we're going to talk about the battle for Brampton. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. We're chatting tonight with John Mykytyshyn. He is a co-founder of the Conservative Leadership Foundation, not Forum, Foundation, that was established a decade or more ago by John and John Capobianco. And they had a conference this past weekend on lessons learned from the last municipal election. And you were just about to launch, and I had to stop you because I really want to get into this. This is going to be fun. So you were up against another conservative activist, Nick Cavalis, who was running another campaign, and you were running, you were campaign manager for Patrick Brown, I understand, and I understand one of the biggest issues was that somebody left the P out of Brampton. So tell us all about that.
Well, you know what? There's sometimes there's just fortuitous moments. People who love baseball would call it an error, right? And this is like an unforced error. So there should have been, in no world should it be possible to happen what happened to their campaign. And campaigns, until you get numbers or until somebody does a poll and releases publicly, there's a lot of chest thumping and we're the best, and oh look, we had a bunch of people to our office opening, that means we're winning or we're a healthy campaign. But you don't really know. And the day you get a good idea, or within the first, to be fair, 3 or 4 days, is when signs go up in any municipality. And I got to tell you, when the signs went up in Brampton on September 30th, so late in the campaign process, right? The election started, I think it was May 2nd, goes to the almost end of October, but we're talking now with only weeks to go, polls opening, a week later for the advance. The polls go up for Nikki Carr, managed by, well, I'm not sure of their titles over there, right? But the huge important influences in that campaign were Nick Cavalis, and to be fair, Marcel Weeder. So people who are significant major backroom political operatives in the Liberal and the Conservative Party, and lo and behold, who didn't do the proofreading. So for your listeners, the reality is, when you put anything to print, your nightmare is somebody made a typo. And it's usually in the world of commas or hyphens or something, almost insignificance. But imagine this, when one of my campaign workers is driving down the street and I get the phone call saying, "You won't believe this." And I said, "What?" And they said, "They misspelt the name of the city." And I went, "What are you talking about?" They spelt Brampton without a P. And I said, "Get me a picture." And we got the picture, and I went, "Get me video." Because in this cynical age, and not unfairly for almost everybody, that if somebody tells you that the two of the highest ranking operatives from two political parties could have not paid attention to details, like making sure before it went to the printer, it was spelt right, or when it came back from the printer, it was spelt right. What did you have? You then had a team of people that took these signs, went out, nailed them up on lawns, and didn't notice that Brampton was spelt wrong. And one of my people found it, and I don't know how many went up before we saw it. All I know is I'm glad that we saw the 2 signs that went up, took our pictures, took our video. We might have shared it with a couple people in the media world. And all of a sudden, when I talk about unforced error, because we're all trying to say we're doing great and we're leading, well, their campaign had to deal with the fact of humiliation. Because how can you have such a fundamental mistake, and it goes beyond just incompetence? How can you run a campaign saying anybody that the candidate is deserving of being mayor when they can't even spell the name of the city?
Well, they made, I guess, both campaigns made good jokes out of it. Take the P out of Brampton, or Brampton's not Brampton without the P.
Well, exactly, right. And the fact that Patrick's first initial is B,
That's my point.
Again, the kind of funny thing that just gives you room to play with.
But it says something else, doesn't it? At least when I saw it, it said to me that they may be high-priced, very capable operatives, but they weren't local. And anyone local knows how to spell Brampton.
Well, to be fair, I think they know how to spell Brampton. I just don't think they were competent in making sure it made it onto the signs correctly.
Okay, well, you're more generous than I. I think that that they actually may have made a mistake, that they actually thought Brampton was spelt without a P. But
I'll go to your point, which is a key one, because I'm not from Brampton either. But the difference is, I know Brampton because my background is research when I started out in politics. And, once you have a bias, you tend to always have it. And mine is research and making sure I know what I'm doing. And when I go to a place that's not mine, I talk to people. And one of the things I discovered, so Cavalis came with his hatred for Patrick Brown from far away. I don't know, because I haven't talked to Marcel, what his motivation was. I know the former mayor was a very good personal friend of his, so I'm sure he came back for vengeance. But they were out of touch with Brampton.
Yeah.
Our internal polling, our tracking, our the different voter contact methods, all of our numbers were around 70% throughout the entire campaign. And I have to tell you that that's what there was when the signs went up on the 30th. It went from, it's a competitive fight, and the media had been playing it up because it was a pretty boring Ontario election, right? Yeah. No big race in Toronto, Oakville, Mississauga, really, yes, in Vaughan, that one, the race, frankly, in Vaughan and in Hamilton were closer than people would have thought. So at the end of the day, it really wasn't interesting to people of the lowest of the 3 tiers of government that gets the lowest turnout anyway.
Yeah.
Usually it's in the 30s for turnout. Last election 4 years ago in Brampton was 30%. This time it dropped to 25%. And I'll tell you that Patrick's vote went from 4 years ago at 45% beating an incumbent, which is almost unheard of, to this time he got 60. And I said a moment ago that we were in the 70s. And I'll tell you that I actually believe that it was the apathy of the people who supported Patrick going, there's no way he's not going to win. I don't have to vote for him. He's fine. And the fact that he was, those people who celebrated Diwali, a lot of them didn't go and vote because they were celebrating, something that was important to them. And they thought Patrick was a given. But the haters always show up to vote. It doesn't matter what the issue is. Protesters who want to protest or people want to vote somebody out, they always show up. So that was, frankly, one of the biggest dangers for Patrick. Wasn't that he didn't have the support of the people. It would be if his people were so complacent that the haters would outnumber his supporters.
So what are the lessons, other than proofread your signs in your literature? What are the lessons from Brampton?
Twitter doesn't matter. What someone says in the middle of the night on Twitter doesn't matter. The other thing is there's a rule in politics that says dominate the dominant media. And, with respect, radio station that, like, I've done races across the province, right? So if you were in Hamilton, Waterloo, Barrie, or Windsor, you could do radio and TV ads that would have impact. You could do newspaper ads that had impact. Well, in Brampton, there isn't anything like that. So the old traditional media doesn't play at all. So we spent no money on traditional media, some money on what would be called ethnic media, some money on online, but our principal weapon, because now that it's over, we all have to report our numbers, and you'll see that in due course 6 months from now. But the reality is we spent over $80,000 on signs. So that day, September 30th, was always part of the strategy, that when it came time for people to actually go down their own street and see what was going on, they would see absolutely without question that Patrick was going to win based on the signs that they drove by or walked by every day.
So people often say signs don't vote. What you're saying is signs in Brampton did vote.
I'm saying signs. It's actually Patrick Brown who taught me that lesson a long time ago when I was doing a different mayor's race in Barrie and defeated again an incumbent. Well, in that situation, I defeated an incumbent mayor. And yes, if they're used right, if they're strategic, and the reality is you can't be 50-50. You've got to go head to head and be the clear winner. Because a certain amount of people you can suppress the other people's vote because they're distraught, and you can embolden your people. And then there's the ones who like to be with the winner, whoever it's going to be. Okay,
so signs counted both positively and negatively for you and for the opponent. What else did you learn?
Money. I have never been involved in a campaign that had so much money. Now, I say that in the context of, if you were to look at ridings federally or provincially in the city, there's 5 ridings, there would be $500,000 for each of the parties to play with. In the mayor's race, it just went up to $308,000. That's woefully underfunded. To try and communicate in any community, municipal politicians aren't being given enough money in 2022 to do it competently compared to the federal or provincial levels. And in those situations, they have another equal amount of money at their central campaigns. So really, municipal politicians have a third of the money that they should have to be able to campaign. So there's the lack of money there, but in there, it's, can you raise what you're allowed to raise? And I gave the advice before I arrived to run the campaign, get money, because I'd looked at what Patrick had done 4 years ago. He'd had a fundraising dinner. They raised a lot of money, and I said, don't wait. Even before I get there, go raise money now. So they had a full dinner before I even arrived. And while we paid bills throughout the campaign, usually within a couple days, throughout the campaign, we had a bank balance of over $100,000.
Okay.
Which is, I got to tell you, most campaigns have a plan, and you might have some experience with campaigns, right? The reality is most people make a plan and then keep on adjusting how they can't do their plan because they don't have money to get anything printed. Yeah. I went and got 10,000 signs printed a month before we needed them. They were sitting in a container behind our office, waiting for the lock to be cracked. And when 5 o'clock arrived on September the 30th, we had a parking lot full of pickup trucks and SUVs. And in 3 days, we had 10,000 signs across Brampton.
And you read the city name, made sure it was right.
Yeah, we got the city name right as well. Yes.
What else did you learn?
It's the danger of being an incumbent, and this happens to everyone. People are happy and complacent. So if you like someone, you're happy, you're complacent, you think they're okay. What's the downside of that? The upside is money, right? Because people like to write checks for money, and anybody who's ever lost and then tried to do fundraising will tell you it's almost impossible. So I knew Patrick would win, but I didn't want to wait to have the money. And the advantage for us was, in having it, it was a distinct advantage that we never had to worry. We just had to have a plan and keep on, monitoring how are things going. Are we missing something? What's the impact of this or that? Yeah. People would say somebody's doing this. What's the impact? There were other campaign candidates, right? There, it wasn't just head to head. There was like 4 other candidates in the race. I was reading 2 of them were fairly prominent. I believe that Cavalis took Nikki Carr from 3rd place to 2nd because there was a guy named Bob Desange Singh who had some of his videos were so good and so comical. I don't know the man's background at all, but I can tell you I loved a couple of his videos. He had this one famously where he, again, throwing accusations and slurs as an opponent against an incumbent, what some people choose to do. But there'd been some accusations that Patrick was a little too kind to some of his developer friends, and he played hockey with them. So Bob, dressed up in goalie attire in front of Brampton City Hall, and then said, "I'm Bob Desange Singh, and I'm here to tell you I'm going to stop Patrick Brown's hockey buddies." And this stuff is still up. And he became a YouTube sensation. He had a ridiculously high number of views. And now the problem was he became so well known. People started imitating him and doing their own versions of him, mimicking him, but it was across the world. He was literally being noticed in countries all over the world, not as much in Brampton.
So it's interesting. You've said social media doesn't really help. You said Twitter doesn't help. Doesn't matter what people say in the middle of the night on Twitter, and it doesn't matter how many views you get on YouTube. And yet, federally, we've got people that are really trying to use social media, TikTok or YouTube or Facebook like never before.
Well, that would be one of the realities. Would be if you have something, why do you not try? The question is, can you use it effectively, make a difference? So in the last federal campaign, for example, our NDP leader used TikTok famously, and he used it very well. And the only people who did worse than him was the People's Party and the Greens. So, right, it's a question of effectiveness. And at the end of the day, does it move vote? So one of the little secrets I gave was in the early weeks of that campaign. So Patrick came into the race mid-August, just before the deadline. And the reality is that it was very lonely. Me and the assistant I hired, we felt like the Maytag repairman in this beautiful office that we got, because there were no people there. And that worried me, but we knew we had all the right dynamics. So that was okay for us. And then what needed to happen to guarantee Patrick's win happened. As we were getting ready to get out to vote, as we got ready for they had 2 weeks of advance voting. So really we had 3 election weekends. And I got to tell you that the people who believed in Patrick showed up in droves. So while we had an amazing sign crew, we then had all of these different communities. So Patrick Brown supporters is a community of communities. And they showed up, and they showed up in droves, and they worked. I mean, there wasn't a corner of the office the last 2 weeks where somebody wasn't sitting on a cell phone making a phone call, where people weren't putting kits together for canvassers or sorting stuff out to be dropped by the literature teams. Patrick had hundreds of people out on the street with no party infrastructure. So it was pretty amazing.
Explain something to me. He obviously had some issues in the Conservative Party provincially when he had to resign as leader of the Progressive Conservative Party, and then he had some issues federally when he wasn't allowed to continue the leadership. And I'm not going to say he's the Teflon man, because he's not the Teflon man. Stuff does stick to him, but he seems to be able to power through it and still win. What is it about Patrick Brown? How can you go through those swamps? And
so let me suggest that the world has changed since you and I started paying attention to politics. Back in that era, what happens today would destroy people 12 times over. So before there was Trump, there was Rob Ford, right? And that guy got elected and was on the verge of getting reelected again, despite all his problems and demons. And then we saw Trump, despite all of his issues, got elected. Now, not enough to get him reelected, but then we just come north to Canada, And if you start to list the number of scandals or misdemeanors, just short of crimes for our prime minister, if you're not a complete Trudeau devotee, you're shocked at how big that list is. And I got to tell you, does anything matter to anybody anymore? And then we look at, the dynamic of the last couple elections in Ontario, and Doug got elected primarily because the premier before him got thrown out. The people rejected Wynne. They got to a point where they said enough, and she was gone. And then we go 4 years further, and what happens? The Liberal vote that Wynne lost did not come back for Del Duca. He ended up with the same bad group of the same low number of votes. The NDP were in a race to the bottom. Doug Ford lost in the last 4 years 1 out of 3 of his voters, and yet he still started with a bigger number. So when the NDP decided to not make people excited and lose their vote and have their people stay home, because clear NDP voters did not leave her and go to the Liberals. They went, and I'm betting none of them went to the premier. So the premier lost voters, Del Duca got no new ones, and the NDP lost. So we're currently in a race to the bottom. And I got to tell you, my gut is we're going to see something similar at the federal scene. But fundamentally, you've got to do something like almost beyond imagination to get thrown out of office. And if you were to think back to Kathleen Wynne, what was it? And really, it was just a culmination of bad government, and they'd had enough. And they're not there yet with Ford. They're not yet there with Trudeau. And clearly with Patrick Brown, not only are they not there, he got more votes than he got in the previous election, and his percentage went up from 45 to 60%.
So her Minister of Finance is running in a by-election right now, and some people criticized their last budget. What do you think his chances are? Will people even remember?
I got to tell you, because that's your neighborhood, right? Mississauga Lakeshore it's not a solid Liberal seat, but it's a pretty solid Liberal seat. So unless there's a compelling reason, and that's what by-elections are supposed to be about. By-elections are the opportunity to give the message to a government that even they might like, that they're not thrilled with the job they're doing and they better get it together. And so from a conservative perspective, from a Pierre Poilievre's Conservative Party perspective, there should be no way in the world, like the next general election, that they can lose this by-election. That is in a seat that when Harper won majority governments, he won that seat. So how could you possibly, given that most by-elections go against the government, and people are saying Pierre's doing great across the board, there should be no question whatsoever that the Conservatives are not going to win that by-election. And yet the Liberals found as close to a rock star as you can within a political party, right? That gentleman is a significant person, former cabinet minister, former finance minister, whereas the Conservative candidate is much more of your, regular person. So it's not rock star to rock star, and the Liberals already held the seat. And the only thing that's really changed has been Pierre. So this almost become a referendum for some people on the new Conservative leader.
So I'll agree with you other than one thing. I think it is the most conservative riding in Mississauga. So it's not a liberal, it's not a strong liberal seat. It's gone conservatively provincially. The Liberal who held it for most of Pecha's time period was a right to life gentleman. So a pretty right-wing Liberal, even though he was a Liberal. And I think you're right that when Conservatives want to form a majority, they've got to win some seats in the 905, and they got to win some seats in PL. And this one is one of the seats that they should win. It's got more.
And it's a by-election. And it's a by-election. So it should be interesting to watch. Anyway, we're going to take a break for some messages and come back more on some of the other panels that John oh my God, I messed it up. Mykytyshyn had at the
What Did We Learn conference by the Conservative Leadership Foundation. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga Night 60. Got to tell you that in politics, you always run into people, even when they're on another team, that you have a lot of respect for. And John Mykytyshyn is one of those guys that even if he was on another team, I had huge amounts of respect for. He's one of the guys that you didn't want to go into a corner of a hockey rink with, because you were convinced those elbows would be up and hitting strong, just like Gordie Howe. John had a conference just last weekend of the Conservative Leadership Foundation. So it was primarily conservatives, I think, that were there. But it was about lessons learned during the last municipal election. And he's talked a little bit about Doug Ford's change right after the election in regards to the influence, the power that local municipalities had to elect regional chairs. He effectively took that away. And then he talked about the Battle of Brampton, where he was up against Marcel Weeder and Nick Cavalis, two long-term activists, both within the Liberal and the Conservative Party. Really good campaign managers. I've had the pleasure of working with both of them in the past and different times. And so they know what they're doing. But John beat them, and beat them handily with Patrick Brown. So tell us about some of the other panels. You had a panel of campaign managers and you had a panel of media.
So I was going to say that, the next one up was the managers panel. And it was gratifying from a couple of perspectives, because one of the, again, common wisdoms politically is that you can't beat an incumbent. And it's hard, because they have 4 years to put down roots and to build sandbags around their wards to try and get reelected. And we had 3 managers who did different parts of the GTA. And each of them have been involved in taking out an incumbent. And, so we had some great stories and great insights at that next lower level. And it was just great to hear what they shared. And one of them was particularly gratifying for me, because it was a former graduate, one of our young people. We used to run these things called the weekend youth retreat, or as it may have been famously called by the CBC, boot camp for politics, and where we would take people and it would mimic a campaign, and they literally would work for 3 days with almost no sleep, and they'd be tested. It wouldn't be sit in a room and get an opinion. No, we tested them on the way in the door, and we tested them on the way out, and it was rigorous training. And here we are, 6 years after. 6 years after one of these people attended the last one, because we do them infrequently, because it's a volunteer organization. And here he is, having taken on Gila Martau's return to municipal politics, and she ran and beat a 5-term incumbent. So he had some great stories to tell, and again, edified and gratified that a part of his presentation was the fact that he was excited to come because he was a graduate of the Conservative Leadership Foundation. The knowledge he got from that, he was finally having the big shot to be the #1 guy, to be the manager and make those decisions. Okay, and so that was very gratifying.
What's the secret to beating an incumbent then?
You have to find a chink in the armor. You have to find a way. There's usually something, and you just have to find out what it is, and then you have to do everything right.
Tell us who was the campaign manager, and what was the campaign, please?
Gila Martau in the Thornhill area. I'm not sure exactly of the constituency, but and William Hart was the young gentleman who ran the campaign. So
find a chink in the armor.
So in the chink in the armor, right? So that's it for all campaigns, right? You got to find where the opportunity is, and often, frankly, with incumbents, it's complacency. They don't think they've been there. They're safe. Everybody knows they're safe, so they don't raise the money. They don't knock on the doors. They don't bring out the volunteers. And then if you're the young upstart or the older upstart, and you decide to go, hell bent for leather and give it everything you got, there's a way to win. So that was the managers panel. Then the next one we had was a nice lunch break, great networking opportunity. The event was at the RCMI, which is the Royal Canadian Military Institute, which is an amazing, wonderful building that they've rebuilt and made into a living museum, basically. And at that, so after the lunch, the next panel was a media panel. And we had Tasha Kierden, we had John Moore, we had Mark Toohey, and we had Rajinder Sani. So a great all-star panel who all came with their observations for, what they had, seen and learned and noticed that was kind of different. And then, equally compelling are the questions that come from the audience that probe and push. And, as always happens when we do one of these events, people said, John Moore, he's not known as a conservative. And it's like, well, because Warren Kinsella is on vacation, so he wasn't able to join us this time. And it's like, Warren Kinsella, it's like, right, because the Conservative Leadership Foundation, one of our fundamental principles is that we believe that you can learn something from everywhere and everyone. And what our society's gone down the road of and becoming the world of silos, where if you and I don't agree 100%, then we can't talk to each other anymore. So we fundamentally challenge that, and we invite people from different voices to come and join us. So that was an amazing media panel. And then the last panel.
Oh, hold on a second. Let me ask you a question, though. I apologize for interrupting. My sense is the media did a terrible job. Now, maybe it's because, as you said, that there was no really interesting campaigns, but media didn't pay much attention at all. And I did a show comparing what happened in BC to what happened in Ontario. And BC, in council after council, mayor's post after mayor's post, they were overturned in British Columbia. So people really were interested. And the issues were the same issues. They were affordability. They were, property taxes. They were transit. Similar issues in BC. And it caused the electorate to turn over the vast majority of mayors and the vast majority of councils, particularly in the urban areas and suburban areas. But that didn't happen in Canada. It didn't happen in Ontario at all. No. So I think media did a terrible job.
Well, because there was no exciting race to excite the media. I frankly think, for the most part, the media has gotten very lazy on what they're, on the coverage. Right now, part of that is a function of, we're going through this destruction, evolution of traditional media, and yet that creates great opportunities, right? So, I tell people from time to time, especially when we have these schools and we have younger people in the room, imagine an era before a cell phone. Imagine that, it was radio or TV, right? There was no podcast. There was no go back and watch something or listen to something that was on earlier in the day, right? Literally, it was newspaper clippings that might have been put together at 6 a.m. and given out to the campaign team for 7 a.m. And that was it for media, unless you were watching live news during the day. And the resources that traditional media have are different than they used to be. The personnel is certainly different than it used to be. And that's having an impact.
But John...
And yet it's creating an opportunity for citizen journalists to go out there and create a new space. And the question is, can they replace and be as good as certainly a lot of the existing media that weren't really doing a good job anyway?
When you think about the issues, and you started off the show with them, Bill 23 is a complete provincial change to municipalities, their rights, their responsibilities in housing. It's unbelievable. The changes where effectively what Ford is doing is telling them to get off their whatever and start allowing homes to be built. And that's the affordability issue. You already talked about the change to regional chairs, where they're effectively imposing their own choices of regional chairs on numerous different governments. You're talking about how potentially that there could be a change in municipal and regional government coming up in the future. So, lots of issues. And you think about the investment in transit, lots of issues, but media didn't talk about it.
Yep. It's hard to explain, right? And from
did they answer it? Were they questioned about that?
No,
I think you're right. They were lazy.
No, and this becomes the interesting thing, right? So, when we had one of the mainstream journalists come in the last week of the campaign, one of the Toronto people, television people, come in to give an interview or do an interview. A lot of the questions weren't anything that you're talking about. They were, for Patrick, it was, this cloud, these accusations, the stuff from the past, the stuff that the haters say. And it's like not relevant to the people on the ground.
I guess part of the problem is that the media focuses almost exclusively on the horse race and exclusively on dog stuff, horse manure, and not about the issues. And people are worried about affordability. They're worried about inflation. They're worried about food banks.
Absolutely. Because that's reality, but those are tough conversations, and having tough conversations isn't exactly what the media is known for the most part. I was asked why, after the interview, what my personal take was on why Patrick seems to engender so much animosity from some people. And I said, well, it's pretty straightforward. We just had all these elections, right? And if you think about it, we just had a municipal election. We had a provincial one a few months ago. Last year we had a federal, and no one could tell you who 99.9% of the politicians are. You couldn't come up with a name. Say, I'll give you $100 for every politician's name. You could retire for how many politicians in Canada there are, but people can't think of them because for the most part, those people are happy to get elected, sit quietly, get their check, and worry about re-election. And there's very few politicians. If you were to go to Bill 21 in Quebec, something that Patrick, that got him into the federal leadership race. Well, there wasn't a politician in this country that was willing to stand up and say, what the Quebec government is doing is first wrong and second racist. What is wrong with these people? Because all of our federal politicians, including the leaders of all of the federal parties, were afraid of offending Quebec and losing votes.
Yeah.
People are afraid of having a serious conversation. So if they won't have a serious conversation, and it's all about the photo op, and it's all about the nice hair and the nice suit, people, especially when, I think people are worried more than they've been in a long time, and they're caring more. And today, right now, November, 2022, we're not over COVID. And COVID might be over as a pandemic, but one of the big contributions it made to society is every single person is now aware of the concept of mental health. They're aware of anxiety, and they're aware that they never want to get locked down in their caves again. Having a man cave, having a house, having a home, whatever that looked like, might be a wonderful, cherished thing until you're told you can't leave it. So, society isn't over that. We had one good summer, and it was too short. So right now, Canadians, Ontarians are grumpier than they've been in a long time, but it hasn't manifested.
Grumpier, but they elected Ford in a majority.
But it hasn't manifested in a repudiation of politicians yet, except in spot circumstances.
We're chatting with John Mykytyshyn tonight about what he learned during the last municipal election and a conference he had on that topic. We're going to take a final break and come back with some concluding comments in just 2 minutes. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. It's a real pleasure of mine to be able to drill some questions into John Mykytyshyn, who is a long-term conservative activist. He's a campaign manager, campaign worker, pollster, a guy that does everything in the conservative sphere of politics in Ontario and Canada, and someone that I've enjoyed watching and competing with at times in the past. And he had a conference a couple of weeks ago, last week actually, about what we learned during the last municipal election that was put on by the Conservative Leadership Forum. Is that correct? Leadership Foundation. Yep. That he is a co-founder of. John, some people think that Pierre Poilievre and the Conservative Party federally have moved to the right. And other people think that the Liberal Party, particularly in its merger / supply and whatever agreement accord with the NDP, have moved to the left. And that there's a gaping hole in the middle where the vast majority of people are that might be, called fiscal conservative, social progressive, whatever. frankly, people probably that would have supported Patrick Brown as a red Tory, as a progressive conservative in the past. In that kind of situation, and I've actually been out talking to some people in Mississauga Lakeshore, and it's interesting to me. There's hatred out there. People hate Pierre Poilievre, and they hate the idea of that he was a vaccine denier, or thought that he was, that he supported the what they call the occupation in Ottawa, that he met with the truckers, etc. And then the next door, they hate Justin Trudeau for the exact opposite reasons. And it's more hatred than I've ever seen in politics before. And it's obviously not everybody. It's one group of people that hate Pierre Poilievre and one group of people that hate Justin Trudeau. And there doesn't seem to be a spot in the middle for reasonable people to be. And turnout is down. And people are getting sick of the situation. And as we've pointed out, media may not be doing its job. They're only doing the horse race. What do you do? If you're a political guy, do you just take that and just identify your vote and get it out? Or is there something you can do to change it and get turnout up? Or do you want to?
Well, so there's different ways to run campaigns and different choices candidates and leaders get to make as to who they want to be. But fundamentally, elections are about making a choice. The question is, do the parties and the leaders give them a choice? And you're right. It might be, who do I hate less? Quite sadly and quite often, I mean, you look at Ontario again, the last provincial, big drop in no growth in Liberal support, big drop in NDP support, big drop in Conservative support. People just said, I'm staying home. I'm staying home. And I got to tell you, there's, because I made this point on the weekend when in our last session with the government relations panel we had, when we were talking about the low turnout, and I said, hang on a second here. I respect all voters. I respect the person who says either a pox in all their houses. I wish I had the option on a ballot to say none of the above, so I could be heard. And conversely, the person next to them having a pint saying, well, I didn't vote because either they're all the same, or I'm quite content, or I'm not mad enough to go get my pitchfork. So for whatever the reason, elections are about, go back to to me, what I was taught, the era of Lincoln, right? You got to give people a choice, and then you make your case, and you go find the people that think the way you do, you make a list, and then you get them out to vote. And if we're not having increasingly higher numbers, then the parties and the leaders are failing at that. And then it's up to them to answer why.
In the last election in the United States, the midterms, some people are interpreting it, the reason why the Democrats weren't devastated was because of the abortion issue, and that motivated young people to come out, and females to come out to vote Democrat instead of Republican, and that increased turnout within those demographics, young and female, was the reason. Do we have an issue like that in Canada that can motivate people to come out and vote?
I don't think we do. But having said that, I think if you look, especially in the last few days, there's sort of a sleeper issue. Not all of them are sexy, but something that Aaron O'Toole was pretty good at working at and arguing and fighting for. And Pierre has done a little bit as well. I mean, to be fair, he hasn't been there quite that long yet. He's been there a couple months. And I'm talking about the China file. And what did we have this week? We have this big announcement by one of the charter fanboys of communist China, our Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, who's now laid out this China is a danger. We're going to spend a lot of money. We're going to start watching these guys. They got to be held in check. I'm willing to say that I could have won $1,000 bet with almost anybody in any political party that any of those words would have never come out of the Prime Minister's mouth a month ago. So politicians don't make big pronouncements like that. And that's a significant change in his policy, in his actions, in his positioning. And I don't think it's coincidental that it's coming just after the ending of the inquiry into the whole trucker and use of the new laws in Ottawa, because he wants to turn the page, and turning the page requires something big. And he did two things at the same time. He ended that last day with his testimony, making an awful lot of people think that he was pretty reasonable. And so he did well coming out of it at the end, as well as he could have, I think. And secondly, the next week, he's talking about major policy issues that the Conservatives were the only ones talking about. And one of the great things about being prime minister is stealing, especially a Liberal, is stealing good ideas from another party, because the Conservatives and the NDP can promote policy, they can talk about changes, but what happens when the government actually listens to you and says, that's a great idea, thank you very much, and then goes and runs with it? What do you do?
Well, stolen or not,
remember 2 to 3 years ago that the Conservatives had concerns about China when the Liberals have been doing it for 2 or 3 years.
Stolen or not, I think it's a good policy, and I think that Chrystia Freeland sort of telegraphed that about a month ago. But
yeah.
That'll be something we'll be debating for a while. Anyway, John Mykytyshyn, thank you so much for joining us tonight and telling us a little bit about what was learned during the last municipal elections. Really appreciate it. Anytime you want to come back and talk politics or political campaigns with me, it would be a pleasure to have you back. I really admire you, sir. Thanks for joining us. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure, and thanks again for the invite.
I remind you, I'm on every Monday through Friday at 6 o'clock. You can stream me online, even from Dundas at www.saga960am.ca. All my podcasts and video casts are available after we broadcast on the radio at briancrombie.com. Good night, everybody. Thanks again, John.